Section 2. The Story of Atlantis by William Scott-Elliot. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of Atlantis, Part 2. Fifth. It only remains now to summarize some of the evidence obtainable from ancient writers, from early race traditions, and from archaic flood legends. Aelian, in his Varia Historia, Book 3, Chapter 18, states that Theopompus, 400 BC, recorded an interview between the king of Phrygia and Silenus, in which the latter referred to the existence of a great continent beyond the Atlantic, larger than Asia, Europe, and Libya together. Proclus quotes an extract from an ancient writer who refers to the islands in the sea beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Straits of Gibraltar, and says that the inhabitants of one of these islands had a tradition from their ancestors of an extremely large island called Atlantis, which for a long time ruled over all the islands of the Atlantic Ocean. Marcellus speaks of 7 islands in the Atlantic, and states that their inhabitants preserve the memory of a much greater island, Atlantis, which had for a long time exercised dominion over the smaller ones. Diodorus Siculus relates that the Phoenician discovered a large island in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, several days' sail from the coast of Africa. But the greatest authority on this subject is Plato. In the Timaeus he refers to the island continent, while the Critias or Atlanticus is nothing less than a detailed account of the history, arts, manners, and customs of the people. In the Timaeus he refers to a mighty warlike power, rushing from the Atlantic Sea and spreading itself with hostile fury over all Europe and Asia. For at that time the Atlantic Sea was navigable, and had an island before that mouth which is called by you the Pillars of Hercules. But this island was greater than both Libya and all Asia together, and afforded an easy passage to other neighbouring islands, as it was likewise easy to pass from those islands to all the continents which border on this Atlantic Sea. There is so much of value in the Critias that it is not easy to choose, but the following extract is given, as it bears on the material resources of the country. They had likewise everything provided for them, which both in a city and every other place is sought after as useful for the purposes of life. And they were supplied indeed with many things from foreign countries, on account of their extensive empire. But the island afforded them the greater part of everything of which they stood in need. In the first place the island supplied them with such things as are dug out of mines in a solid state, and with such as are melted. And orichalcum, which is now but seldom mentioned, but then was much celebrated, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, and was considered as the most honourable of all metals except gold. Whatever too the woods afforded for builders the island produced in abundance. There were likewise sufficient pastures there for tame and savage animals, together with a prodigious number of elephants, for there were pastures for all such animals as are fed in lakes and rivers, on mountains and in plains. And in like manner there was sufficient aliment for the largest and most voracious kind of animals. Besides this, whatever of odoriferous the earth nourishes at present, whether roots, or grass, or wood, or juices, or gums, flowers, or fruits, these the island produced, and produced them well. The Gauls possessed traditions of Atlantis which were collected by the Roman historian Timagenes, who lived in the 1st century BC. 3 distinct peoples apparently dwelt in Gaul. First, the indigenous population, probably the remains of a Lemurian race. Second, the invaders from the distant island of Atlantis. And third, the Aryan Gauls. See Pre-Adamites, page 380. The Toltecs of Mexico traced themselves back to a starting point called Atlan or Aztlan. The Aztecs also claimed to come from Aztlan. See Bancroft's Native Races, Volume 5, pages 221 and 321. The Popol Vuh, page 294, speaks of a visit paid by 3 sons of the king of the Quiches to a land in the east on the shores of the sea whence their fathers had come, from which they brought back amongst other things a system of writing. See also Bancroft, Volume 5, page 553. Among the Indians of North America there is a very general legend that their forefathers came from a land toward the sun rising. The Iowa and Dakota Indians, according to Major J. Lind, believed that all the tribes of Indians were formerly one and dwelt together on an island towards the sunrise. They crossed the sea from thence in huge skiffs in which the Dakotas of old floated for weeks, finally gaining dry land. The Central American books state that a part of the American continent extended far into the Atlantic Ocean, and that this region was destroyed by a series of frightful cataclysms at long intervals apart. 3 of these are frequently referred to. See Baldwin's Ancient America, page 176. It is a curious confirmation that the Celts of Britain had a legend that part of the country once extended far into the Atlantic and was destroyed. 3 catastrophes are mentioned in the Welsh traditions. Quetzalcoatl, the Mexican deity, is said to have come from the distant east. He is described as a white man with a flowing beard. Note: the Indians of North and South America are beardless. He originated letters and regulated the Mexican calendar. After having taught them many peaceful arts and lessons, he sailed away to the east in a canoe made of serpent skins. See Short's North Americans of Antiquity, pages 268 to 271. The same story is told of Zamna, the author of Civilization in Yucatan. The marvelous uniformity of the flood legends on all parts of the globe alone remains to be dealt with. Whether these are some archaic versions of the story of the lost Atlantis and its submergence, or whether they are echoes of a great cosmic parable once taught and held in reverence in some common centre whence they have reverberated throughout the world, does not immediately concern us. Sufficient for our purpose is it to show the universal acceptance of these legends. It would be needless waste of time and space to go over these flood stories one by one. Suffice it to say that in India, Chaldea, Babylon, Media, Greece, Scandinavia, China, amongst the Jews, and amongst the Celtic tribes of Britain, the legend is absolutely identical in all essentials. Now turn to the West, and what do we find? The same story in its every detail preserved amongst the Mexicans, each tribe having its own version. The people of Guatemala, Honduras, Peru, and almost every tribe of North American Indians. It is puerile to suggest that mere coincidence can account for this fundamental identity. The following quotation from Le Plongion's translation of the famous Troano manuscript, which may be seen in the British Museum, will appropriately bring this part of the subject to a close. The Troano manuscript appears to have been written about 3,500 years ago among the Mayas of Yucatan, and the following is its description of the catastrophe that submerged the island of Poseidonis. In the year 6 Can, on the 11th Muluk, in the month Zak, there occurred terrible earthquakes, which continued without interruption until the 13th Chuen. The country of the hills of mud, the land of Mu, was sacrificed. Being twice upheaved, it suddenly disappeared during the night, the basin being continually shaken by volcanic forces. Being confined, this caused the land to sink and to rise several times and in various places. At last the surface gave way, and 10 countries were torn asunder and scattered. Unable to stand the force of the convulsions, they sank with their 64 million of inhabitants, 8,060 years before the writing of this book. But enough space has now been devoted to the fragments of evidence, all more or less convincing, which the world so far has been in possession of. Those interested in pursuing any special line of investigation are referred to the various works above named or quoted. The subject in hand must now be dealt with. Drawn as they have been from contemporary records, which were compiled in and handed down through the ages we have to deal with, the facts here collected are based upon no assumption or conjecture. The writer may have failed fully to comprehend the facts, and so may have partially misstated them. But the original records are open for investigation to the duly qualified, and those who are disposed to undertake the necessary training may obtain the powers to check and verify. But even were all the occult records open to our inspection, it should be realized how fragmentary must be the sketch that attempts to summarize in a few pages the history of races and of nations extending over at least many hundreds of thousands of years. However, any details on such a subject, disconnected though they are, must be new and should therefore be interesting to the world at large. Among the records above referred to there are maps of the world at various periods of its history, and it has been the great privilege of the writer to be allowed to obtain copies, more or less complete, of 4 of these. All 4 represent Atlantis and the surrounding lands at different epochs of their history. These epochs correspond approximately with the periods that lay between the catastrophes referred to above, and into the periods thus represented by the 4 maps the records of the Atlantean race will naturally group themselves. Before beginning the history of the race, however, a few remarks may be made about the geography of the 4 different epochs. The first map represents the land surface of the earth as it existed about 1,000,000 years ago, when the Atlantean race was at its height, and before the first great submergence took place, about 800,000 years ago. The continent of Atlantis itself, it will be observed, extended from a point a few degrees east of Iceland to about the site now occupied by Rio de Janeiro in South America. Embracing Texas and the Gulf of Mexico, the southern and eastern states of America, up to and including Labrador, it stretched across the ocean to our own islands, Scotland and Ireland, and a small portion of the north of England forming one of its promontories, while its equatorial lands embraced Brazil and the whole stretch of ocean to the African Gold Coast. Scattered fragments of what eventually became the continents of Europe, Africa and America, as well as remains of the still older and once widespread continent of Lemuria, are also shown on this map. The remains of the still older Hyperborean continent, which was inhabited by the second root race, are also given, and, like Lemuria, coloured blue. As will be seen from the second map, the catastrophe of 800,000 years ago caused very great changes in the land distribution of the globe. The great continent is now shorn of its northern regions, and its remaining portion has been still further rent. The now growing American continent is separated by a chasm from its parent continent of Atlantis, and this no longer comprises any of the lands now existing, but occupies the bulk of the Atlantic basin from about 50 degrees north to a few degrees south of the equator. The subsidence and upheavals in other parts of the world have also been considerable. The British Islands, for example, now being part of a huge island, which also embraces the Scandinavian peninsula, the north of France, and all the intervening and some of the surrounding seas. The dimensions of the remains of Lemuria, it will be observed, have been further curtailed, while Europe, Africa and America have received accretions of territory. The third map shows the results of the catastrophe which took place about 200,000 years ago. With the exception of the rents in the continents both of Atlantis and America, and the submergence of Egypt, it will be seen how relatively unimportant were the subsidences and upheavals at this epoch. Indeed, the fact that this catastrophe has not always been considered as one of the great ones is apparent from the quotation already given from the sacred book of the Guatemalans, 3 great ones only being there mentioned. The Scandinavian island, however, appears now as joined to the mainland. The 2 islands into which Atlantis was now split were known by the names of Ruta and Daitya. The stupendous character of the natural convulsion that took place about 80,000 years ago will be apparent from the 4th map. Daitya, the smaller and more southerly of the islands, has almost entirely disappeared, while of Ruta there only remains the relatively small island of Poseidonis. This map was compiled about 75,000 years ago, and it no doubt fairly represents the land surface of the earth from that period onwards till the final submergence of Poseidonis in 9564 BC, though during that period minor changes must have taken place. It will be noted that the land outlines had then begun to assume roughly the same appearance they do today, though the British Islands were still joined to the European continent, while the Baltic Sea was non-existent and the Sahara Desert then formed part of the ocean floor. End of section 2.